let's now welcome political analyst Mr. Thobani Zikalala. Thobani, it's always good to have you with us. Welcome. So let's talk about what has actually turned now Gayton McKenzie into a dark horse with the emergence of his so-called racist tweets. What do you think about this?
Good afternoon, Alicia, and good afternoon to your viewers. I think the first challenge that we have to deal with this country is that we have a very bad conceptual understanding of what racism and racists are. It's very unfortunate and it's very bad that someone like Gayton McKenzie, who of course is in the political space and in the political leadership of this country, is found to hold such deep-seated prejudices and stereotypes against Black African people. But in the same vein, I think we will miss a very big teachable moment in this country if we don't reflect really on what our basic understanding of what racism is. Racism is a question of power by a particular group against a particular group on the basis of stereotypes, prejudices, and what you call it. But the very basic tenet of racism is that it is a question of power where law, politics, the economy, and cultural expressions is used to subjugate, oppress, and exploit another group on the basis of their racial standing. And I think if we don't reflect on racism on those bases, we'll reach a very teachable moment. I think Gayton McKenzie, of course, as someone who came up very harsh on the podcasters who were found to have had uttered racial stereotypes or racial prejudices, which at themselves cannot be described as racism. Black people in the main have been systematic victims of racism as a political, economic, organizing philosophy or idea. It is very difficult then for us to now in 2025 to in turn say that the victims of racism could be in turn be the ones who are racist without having altered the systems that made them victims of racism in the first place. Of course, I think those who have called for the minister to be brought into account on this have been very correct, but I think if we continue to use this very bad conceptual understanding of what racism is, we'll miss a very teachable moment. Another point I'm going to say is that in this country, we seem to have adopted this idea of cancel culture, which I consider as very evil because it misses a point where people could be taught and be corrected on their wrongs and simply wants to discard them in society without really reflecting on how some people may have a very, unguided views on particular points. For example, how we reacted to the podcasters of the open chat.
You know, very interesting that you mention that, in fact, that you make that definition there, Thobani, of racism actually being a power game amongst racial social positioning, because I wanted to say that Gayton actually argues that he's a black man, right? And therefore, this cannot be seen as a direct attack against the black race because he apparently recognizes or sees himself as a black person. I don't know how this should be interpreted by black South Africans, right? And I want you to unpack this in terms of our current social construct, as well as the sensitivity around certain languages, especially if you are one, identify as non-black, and two, a public figure. What likely impact will his utterances have in the long run, should of course he be cancelled or removed from government?
I mean, Alicia, we can start here. That if we use the very, very basic of understanding of who is black in South Africa, and of course the term black, if we read it, of course, from those who made it popular as a political descriptor or political philosophical descriptor of a particular race of people. Now, Gayton McKenzie, in the most basic of terms, is not wrong to regard himself as black because the so-called colored, the so-called African, and the so-called Indian are to be considered black. Mm-hmm. But this does not mean that within this group, anti-black self-hate, prejudices, and stereotypes are not held by people, members of this group. The very unfortunate part about Gayton is that at some particular platforms, he regards himself as essentially colored and not essentially black, as the political descriptor of the race that is not white, is not European. And I think for me, that's one of the big problems that Gayton will face, is that opportunistically, when he likes for his own political gains, he does not refer to him as black and does not refer to people who look like him, who speak like him, and got a cultural history and cultural standing like him as black, and simply refers them as colored. Now, the other problem is that if Gaten, as a public figure, has this very bad understanding of what race and race relations are in South Africa, and holds this such deep-seated self-hate of blacks, then that is a problem. It's a problem that needs to be fixed. Is it fixed by simply discarding them from society, or it's fixed by this country having a much bigger, better, deeper reflection on what racism is, and of course how it expresses itself? Are black people capable of holding anti-black stereotypes and having anti-black behaviors? Yes. But in the current social political understanding of this country, will black people, being the majority, excluded from the economy and things and related systems, then black people do not have the position to be able to exercise the power that is a very key tenet of what racism is. So I think post 1994 in this country, we simply have forgotten and our basic understanding of what racism is. And we've now treated racism as some interpersonal thing that is based on simply just stereotypes without considering the history of power as a very basic tenet of what racism has been in this country. And we've also forgotten who are the historical racism victims in this country. And if we don't have that nice, very correct, astute understanding of racism, we will continue not being able to deal with racism in this country because we want to treat it as some bad behavior by one individual and not look at it as a structural, systematic issue of how a group of people using, of course, stereotype prejudices, power is used to oppress them, to exclude them, exploit them on the basis of their race. And I think if we don't have that what you call deeper meditation around the race question in this country, which is a fundamental contradiction of how this society has been being able to be organized up to so far, we will miss a very important point. We will not be able to redress and fix South Africa as a country and make sure that we've got better race relations if we don't really have an honest, deeper meditation on what this racism is.
And it's a very sensitive issue, right, Thobani, specifically when it comes to the Black South African as well as the colored community, because when you listen to how he actually defines himself as colored, specifically in that differentiation where he makes between, of course, how the government wanted to go and bury and assist the family of Mampinja because he's black versus AKA, where they did not want to come and assist in terms of assisting with the burial costs. So Black South Africans also, we don't willy-nilly use the K word when we make references to each other. So that in its own, I mean, we need to be tone sensitive in how we actually reference ourselves. And the fact that now various political parties have since laid official complaints, both in Parliament as well as the South African Human Rights Commission, after, of course, a social media storm saw his old tweets being brought back. What type of action are you hoping should be meted out against him come this week?
I think over and above the fact that McKenzie must be really, and many like who think like him, but there are many, both in the so-called African, in the so-called Indians, and in the so-called colored communities, and of course in the main in terms of white people, but we can't equate, of course, the racial differentiations between those two groups. But in the main, within what we can call the broader black group in the country, there is some deep-seated self-hate and very bad stereotyping of the different races. And of course, you are correct to say McKenzie opportunistically refers to himself as black and colored and black whenever he sees fit. That's another problem. But another problem is that he uses a very bad word, right, that was used particularly by a group people using their systemic power
to dehumanize black people,
oppress a particular group.
Yes,
right? A group that was hell-bent on oppressing a particular group used the so-called K word, right? And now to have someone who says they identify as part of that group to willy-nilly use the kafir word, for me, is problematic, the so-called K word. I'm sorry to put it that way. I mean, sometimes we use these words and we give them so much power and when we don't say them for what they are. But Gayton McKenzie must be brought in account. Does this mean that he gets to be referred as a racist? I don't think so, because as I've been explaining on what racism is and the history of racism, the bit of history of racism, but those racial prejudices can't be uttered by someone holding public office in this country. In particular, someone also have a much appreciation of what racialization and racism and anti-black racism and anti-black hate has done to this country and to the majority of more than 80% of this country. So should he continue to hold office? I do not think so. But does that mean that we didn't describe them as a racist and we don't engage in a much deeper conversation as a country on our understanding of what racism is and making sure that we deal with the systemic issues that continue to perpetuate and maintain racism in this country? Because we may deal with Gayton McKenzie today, another misguided public leader or another misguided citizen of this country who, of course, may identify as black, will utter same utterances if we don't come out correctly to say what is wrong about what Gayton McKenzie has done. I think for me, that's a big problem, that we must have a deeper conversation. As particular, I would say this, that in particular, the so-called broader black group in this country, which includes the so-called Indian, the so-called colored, and the so-called African, that we need, as Steve Biko said, to have an internal conversation amongst ourselves to recognize the deep-seated self-hate that we may, and prejudices that we hold against each other. If you go to KwaZulu-Natal and you go to Western Cape, people, in particular those two provinces, people will tell you about the type of relations they have within this broader black political group and how this has created tensions and problems. And because we have not confronted for years, this is why we find ourselves where people like Gayton McKenzie and many others can have such thought about the Africans of this country.
You know, it was quite interesting, Thobani, because during the elections campaigns, I don't know if you remember, certain parties in specific provinces were garnering for a colored vote. I don't know if you remember that as well. So I suppose this could be one of the issues that need to be top of that national dialogue that is said to be starting come the 15th of August. Thobani, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. As always, great input there. Mr. Thobani Zikalala is a political analyst weighing in there on Minister Gayton McKenzie being accused of being racist against black South Africans.